This video is sponsored by Bespoke Post. Sometime around the year 330 BC, the Greek navigator Pytheas and his crew came across a mysterious far north island that he would describe as a misty land of endless splendor, a bountiful paradise surrounded by crystal clear waters upon which the sun never set. Adventurers and explorers who later stumbled upon the same land went on to report that it was inhabited by a race of strongmen, virtuous and incorruptible, a people who lived in the manner of the mythological Golden Age. This mysterious, still unknown island, located in the northernmost stretches of Europe, was given the name of Ultima Thule, Ultima meaning the most extreme, the farthest point on the globe beyond which nothing else exists. Throughout classical Roman and Greek literature, Thule was thought to be a perfect paradise like the Garden of Eden. It was heaven on earth, perched upon its very edge. Hey fellow seekers, welcome. I'm Mr. Mythos. If you're a fan of strange and ancient mysteries with research so deep you're guaranteed to fall down the rabbit hole, you're in the right place. I humbly ask that you give this video a like and ding the notifications bell so you don't miss any of the rare info we'll be digging into every Saturday. Though Thule has been spoken of for thousands of years, even visited, its location remains unclear to this day. Greco-Roman literature is rich with tales of mythical islands. Atlantis is typically the first to come to mind. However, rarely do we hear of its more enigmatic cousin, Thule. But before we dive into this mystery, and if you've got a heart for adventure, why don't we find out what's in this box? Bespoke Post. They're this video's sponsor, so let me tell you a little bit about them. Every month, Bespoke Post sends cool new products from small brands, including adventuring gear, barware, and even hot sauces. They'll figure out exactly what you'll love based on a preference quiz, and you can preview your box before it ships. Keep it if you love it, swap it, or even just skip the month, no charge. Every box is about $70 in retail value, but only costs $45. Let's get these bad boys open with this sweet knife Bespoke also sent me. Alright guys, I'm gonna try these out. It's been some time, I'm here to report back. So this first box here was called the Cask, and right now I've actually got some moonshine in this. It's not quite ready yet, but since it's so small, it's going to age it super fast. Look at this little stand it came with, and even a bottle. You know I'll be using that. Alright, and this next box is called the Retreat. So it's a hammock. I mean, look how portable this thing is, and it comes with a blanket that folds into a pillow. I can't wait to be using this thing in the spring. A little cold outside right now. Alright, and this last one is called the Weekender. And I've been holiday traveling with this, but you know what I found out? It's the perfect fit for this one and the hammock and a whole bunch of other good stuff too. Alright, I can confidently give Bespoke Post the Mr. Mythos thumbs up. For 20% off your first box, click the link in the description and enter Mythos20 at checkout, or go to bsbk.me/Mythos20. Thanks again to Bespoke. Let's get right into Thule, beginning with the man who discovered it, Pytheas. The first man to come across the mysterious island of Thule was Pytheas, a famous Greek navigator of the 4th century BC. His head of luscious hair and perfectly groomed beard have been immortalized in stone. However, very few people know that Pytheas was the first classical navigator to arrive on the shores of Great Britain and explore the entire northern expanses of Europe, which at the time was a place of mere legend. He documented the famed tin mines of modern-day Cornwall, and he reportedly traveled over 4,000 miles of then rugged British terrain on foot. He visited Norway, France, and even Sweden, and was one of the first ancients to witness the Arctic Circle's midnight sun. And not only was Pytheas a keen navigator, but he was a scientist too. His observation that the moon affects the tides was something scarcely known until Sir Isaac Newton rediscovered it in 1687, almost 2,000 years later. But by trade, Pytheas was a merchant, and it was while he was on a mission to find a source of amber that he happened to come across Thule, completely by chance. Because the location of Thule is still unknown, the route he took is of utmost importance. It's widely accepted that Pytheas' journey began in what is now the port city of Marseille in France, and from there he sailed westward, past the Pillars of Hercules and out into the vast, then unexplored Atlantic Ocean. By all accounts, during this adventure, Pytheas discovered Great Britain and found the ancient Britons mining tin on an island he called Mythos, sailing back and forth from the mainland in intricately woven wicker boats. Leaving them alone, Pytheas then passed through the treacherous, bitterly cold North Sea, and completely by chance, as the freezing sea mist cleared, he set his eyes upon a strange island that he would later name Thule. Surrounding this island was something truly bizarre, which he called a congealed sea. He documented that in this liquid-like substance, quote, neither earth, water, nor air exist separately, but are a sort of concretion of all these, resembling a sea lung in which the earth, the sea, and all things were suspended, end quote. We'll get back to this congealed sea mystery a bit later. At this point, he must have been so far north that there was no day and night cycle. Thule seemed to be stuck in an endless daylight, where there were no nights but the frozen shine of the sun, draped in a foggy mist. It's unfortunate to say that the many adventures of Pytheas, including the more intricate details of his actual landing on Thule, are today virtually unknown. This is because his masterwork, an expansive tome titled On the Ocean, was preserved at the Library of Alexandria, which any bibliophile will painfully know, was burnt to the ground in the year 48 BC. Not a single copy of Pytheas' work survived, and all that remains today are random quotes and references made by contemporary and later scholars. Classical writers such as Strabo, Eratosthenes, Diodorus, Polybius, and Pliny the Elder all confirm that Pytheas' voyage definitely occurred. However, Polybius and Strabo in particular were fierce critics and opponents of Pytheas. Neither believed Thule existed and instead claimed that Pytheas was the, quote, worst possible liar, end quote, and that he had fabricated the existence of Thule to impress the Greek public. Ironically, despite Strabo's open hatred of Pytheas, his legacy is that he is the most accurate and reliable source for Pytheas' writings, following their destruction in the Fire of Alexandria. Strabo lived a few hundred years after Pytheas, though, so he drew most of his information and accusations from Polybius, who was a closer contemporary and perhaps hated Pytheas even more. According to the archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, Polybius' animosity towards Pytheas was really nothing more than just professional jealousy. It's thought that Polybius was jealous of Pytheas because the explorer was considerably more accomplished than he was and could ever hope to be. While Polybius sat and read books, Pytheas went out and saw the world. So, if Polybius' criticism, and thus also Strabo's, can be chalked up to mere jealousy, then we can rule out their claims that the island was an invention of the imagination. Pytheas definitely had his supporters, too. The 1st century Roman author and philosopher, Pliny the Elder, wrote quite a bit on Pytheas and accepted his writings and findings as genuine, Thule included. Moreover, Pytheas' adventure to Thule might have been the first to explicitly call the island by that name. However, other ancient writers had previously alluded to a similar island that sat on the edge of the world, a place called Hyperborea, which we'll get into at the end when we cover esoteric mythology. And similarly, future explorers would witness and even visit the same island and confirm many of Pytheas' other discoveries as fact, leaving us with the question, why would Thule be his sole fabrication? Ultima Thule almost definitely exists, even though we haven't necessarily found it. But where it is only really scratching the surface of a much deeper mystery. Sometime in the 2nd century AD, the Greek explorer Dionysius of Alexandria made a vast voyage and finally landed on an island he believed to be Thule. Like Pytheas, Dionysius observed that a single night on Thule lasted less than 2 hours, if at all, and interestingly, he related it to the ancient belief in Earth's second moon. The myth of Earth's second moon is something rarely spoken of in the modern world, though if you were to suggest to the ancients that it didn't exist, you would be ridiculed. According to the myth, there's a hidden second moon which supposedly refracts the sun's rays and creates daylight for most of the year in specific parts of the world. And this ancient idea is actually part of the far more complex counter-Earth theory, which was first proposed by the Greek philosopher and astronomer Philolaus. Philolaus theorized that every single object in the universe, including the Earth and the Sun, revolved around an unseen central fire, which was an entity completely distinct from the Sun. Because Earth's second moon is supposedly covered in water, when the rays of the central fire are cast upon it, the second moon becomes visible and appears to be lit on fire. And the ancient Greeks believed this to be the cause of the aurora borealis. But returning back to Thule, the Roman historian Gaius Julius Solinus continued the tradition of describing Thule as a place enveloped in eternal daylight. Apparently, Gaius had also arrived upon the island and wrote in his masterwork Polyhistor that it was a paradise, quote, fruitful and abundant in the lasting yield of its crops, end quote. But perhaps neither Gaius Julius Solinus nor Dionysius of Alexandria had the pleasure of meeting the strange and alien-like residents of Ultima Thule. Indeed, many legends have been told of exactly who ruled this northern paradise, and will begin with Thule's unlikely connection to the equally enigmatic Blue Warriors, the Picts of Britain. The Roman poet Claudian wrote in 398 AD that, quote, Thule was warm with the blood of Picts, end quote. It's interesting that Claudian would associate Thule with the Picts. Even in their own time, the Picts were an incredibly mysterious group. Not much was known about them besides the fact that they were ancient and formidable warriors, who struck fear into the hearts of the Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and even the Vikings during their existence. However, the Picts vanished just as quickly as they came, and historians cannot definitively say where this fearsome tribe came from, or where they went. Not only was the Picts' origin and disappearance a true mystery, but so too was how they lived their lives. In the 1970s, a Pictish settlement was discovered and a stash of charm stones were found, indicating that the Picts were a highly mystical society and had their own, still unknown religion. A stone was also discovered with a mythical beast carved into it. This strange dragon-like creature, with a distinctive snout and lengthy curled ears, has been called the Pictish beast, and has never been identified with any living or extinct animal. However, it's since been found on hundreds of Pictish symbol stones, and it accounts for over 40% of all animal depictions made by the Picts, which indicates that the Pictish beast was incredibly important to them. Some cryptozoologists theorized that it may have been a species that only existed in the Picts' homeland. So then, where exactly is this homeland? Claudian was not the only classical writer to associate the Picts with Thule. The 1st century poet Caelius Italicus claimed that Thule's inhabitants were painted blue, as did his contemporary Martial, and the Picts were known to be covered head to toe with blue tattoos. The only clothing they wore were iron chains around their waists and throats. Thus, these warriors were about as blue as one can get, as blue as the race said to inhabit Thule. Thus, many believed that the Pictish ancestral isle was Ultima Thule, but for some reason the Picts were forced into a mass exodus and thus ended up in Britain. The answer as to why the Picts might have left Thule may actually lie in the writings of Eustathius of Thessalonica. He recorded that the native inhabitants of Thule had been engaged in a war against dwarf-like hordes who lived deep beneath the ground, that is, in Inner Earth. These Thule natives, however, were the aggressors. Supposedly, they declared an eternal and everlasting war against the underworld-dwelling dwarves, simply because they considered these little people inferior. However, though these dwarves were only 20 fingers in height, they had the courage of 10 men. So, could it be possible that the Picts were displaced due to a bloody, never-ending war against Inner Earth dwarven barbarians? Perhaps the most bizarre part about this theory is that the 10th century historiographer Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about an ancient Welsh legend in which a race of little people called the Coroniaid, whose civilization lives deep underground, one day emerged on the shores of Great Britain like a plague. The Coroniaid were virtually impossible to defeat, as the wind carried news to them, and their hearing was so sharp that they could hear danger coming before it arrived. In a more straightforward interpretation, these Inner Earth dwarves seem to have the ability to predict the future, and perhaps the Coroniaid knew that the Picts had gone to Britain and followed them there, intent on vanquishing their enemies once and for all. This could explain the disappearance of the Picts, but what about these dwarves? Well, perhaps they remain content in Inner Earth, somewhere deep beneath the island of Thule. Beyond the Picts, there were other theories though, regarding the race of strongmen said to inhabit this northern paradise. The Greek princess and vital 11th century historian Anna Komnene once wrote that the Vikings were, quote, axe-bearing barbarians who originated from Thule, end quote. In fact, in Icelandic and Old English literature, the chief god of Norse mythology, Odin, calls himself the Great Thule, spelled without the E at the end, which some have interpreted as a tribute to this island that may have been the homeland of the Vikings. In Historia Norvegia, an anonymously written history of Scandinavia, there is a suspicious description of a vast deserted island that was once home of the gods. The book calls it the Land of Ice, and it's supposedly made up of mountain after mountain covered in sheets of ice. The author claimed that this island is what the Italians called Ultima Thule, the furthest most Thule or the edge of the world. Today, it is widely accepted that the island the author is actually referring to is modern-day Iceland. There is a strong case for Iceland being Thule, but we'll get into that a bit later. Historia Norvegia described this island as being deserted, and likewise, mythologists have reasoned that Ultima Thule became deserted because the dwarves, having won the island from the Blue Warriors, disappeared underground into their cities set deep into the center of the earth, where they remain to this day, leaving the overground empty of civilization. Historia Norvegia was authored long after the Picts arrived in Great Britain, so this deserted image of Thule certainly makes sense in context. It's also been argued that the true location of Thule is the Norwegian island of Smola. In 2008, a researcher from a German team of scientists stationed there wrote in a letter to a Smola journalist that, quote, about this old information, there cannot be any doubt anymore. You live on the mystic island of Thule, end quote. Today, several ancient Viking burial sites have been discovered on Smola, where Vikings were buried with their most prized possessions and made ready for Valhalla. The mere fact that Viking relics have been found on this desolate, snow-swept island does give weight to Anna Komnene's claim that the Vikings originated on a faraway island thought to be Thule. The inhabitants of Thule were said to be strong northern warriors, which the Vikings undoubtedly were. So, if the Vikings were in fact the ancient inhabitants of Thule, then it begs the question, why did they leave? The author of Historia Norvegia claimed that Ultima Thule was abandoned. So what force could have been intimidating enough to drive the Vikings out? In his writings, Strabo quotes Pytheas and says that the island took, quote, 6 days to reach from Britain, end quote. This has led academics to believe that the island Pytheas encountered was actually Iceland. which is a similar distance, only 6 days of sailing from the British Isles. However, the theory that Iceland is Thule remains highly controversial in the academic world and has been for centuries. But if Thule did exist, then Iceland is a strong candidate. Pytheas wrote of Thule, quote, "There are no nights during the solstice when the sun is passing through the sign of Cancer, and also no days during the winter solstice." End quote. The Canadian explorer and Arctic expert, Vilhjalmur Stephenson, believed that Iceland was the most credible explanation, the reason being that Pytheas was describing a phenomenon that would have been completely alien to the ancient Mediterranean people, this being the absence of night and continuous daylight experienced during the summer months in high latitudes. And Iceland is definitely a location where this phenomenon occurs. Then there is the other phenomenon of the so-called congealed sea, which I mentioned we'd be covering. After Pytheas left Thule and pushed on through the bitterly cold Arctic waters, he was utterly puzzled by what he described as a congealed sea, a liquid-like environment where neither earth, water, nor air exist separately. In his writings, Pytheas compared it to a sea lung. Sea lung is a Greek term for a type of round jellyfish that floats on the surface of the ocean. However, Pytheas was only using this term to describe a never-before-witnessed phenomenon, which scholars today now believe to be pancake ice. Pancake ice is a form of sea ice that's round and floats on the surface, just like the sea lung jellyfish. It's also only found in the Arctic Circle. However, for Iceland to be Thule, then Pytheas must have specifically been at the northernmost part of Iceland. Other scholars have argued that the sea lung could have been pumice, that's been found floating in massive quantities on top of the sea by modern-day explorers. For example, a month before the Icelandic eruption of Loki in 1783, an underwater vent burst and ejected huge quantities of pumice, so much so that up to 150 miles away, the surface of the ocean was covered with it, and all marine travel had to be halted. All this considered, Iceland is definitely the most practical answer. However, the truth may still be stranger. Disappearing islands are supposed islands and even continents that existed in antiquity, but have since disappeared or been swallowed up by the earth. Examples may include Atlantis, High Brazil off the west coast of Ireland, and even Lemuria in the Indian Ocean. It's generally thought that these places sunk into the sea, leaving behind no evidence of their existence but mere legends as their legacy. It is widely accepted that there were places on Earth that were once dry land but became submerged after the Ice Age. In fact, rising sea levels and disappearing islands are often thought of as the origin of Neolithic and Bronze Age flood myths, such as that found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some islands, or even continents, are thought to have been lost due to volcanic eruptions, coastal erosions, and earthquakes. After huge geological cataclysms, parts of continents and islands can be worn down and eventually break away, and then they are consumed by the sea or become their own microcontinents or islands. So this phenomenon is absolutely real. Islands like Atlantis, lost to time, are a common theme across the world and throughout recorded history. However, Thule is perhaps the most peculiar, as references are made to it both during and after the classical period. With the knowledge that islands have sunk into the sea in the past, it makes the island of Thule all the more worthy of its esoteric legacy. If Thule had disappeared into the ocean, it would make a lot more sense than it never existing at all, since we have many accounts from respectable historical figures. The only other explanation is that Thule was indeed Iceland, Smola, or any of the other islands that historians and mythologists have suggested it to be. However, there is one final layer to peel back in this story. No discussion of Thule is complete without a dive into its esoteric side. The mythology was almost definitely inspired by a different lost land, which many people get mixed up with Thule, and it's easy to see why. This lost land is known as Hyperborea, which in ancient Greek mythology is the farthest northern part of the known world, the very edge of the earth. Like Thule, Hyperborea is a paradise, and its civilization is a true utopia. Despite being located at the northernmost stretches, which most people would think of as a frozen tundra, the land of Hyperborea was a temperate and forever sunny land, blessed by the Olympian gods, and in particular Apollo, the god of music, poetry, art, healing, sun, light, and truth. In the 5th century BC, the great Greek poet Pindar described this otherworldly place, quote, "Never the muses absent from their ways. Lyres clash and flutes cry, and everywhere maiden choruses whirling. Neither disease nor bitter old age is mixed in their sacred blood. Far from labor and battle they live." End quote. Classical Greek and Roman writers such as Pliny the Elder, Herodotus, Virgil, and Cicero all reported that the inhabitants of Hyperborea, known as the Hyperboreans, lived to be 1,000 years old and enjoyed their paradise in complete pleasure. In particular, the Hyperboreans had a penchant for feasting and collecting gold. But beyond long, lovely lives, the ancient Greek legends identified the kings of Hyperborea as giants. This belief was preserved by the Roman writer Aelian, who stated, quote, "This god, Apollo, has as priests the sons of Boreas, 6 cubits in height." End quote. 6 cubits is about 10 feet or 3 meters tall, which definitely qualifies as a giant, and these giant kings were ones to be feared. In the 4th century BC, the Greek historian Theopompus recorded that once a massive army of soldiers from another island, which some interpret as Atlantis, had planned an invasion of Hyperborea. However, this plan was abandoned after their reconnaissance realized that the Hyperboreans were physically strong, beyond their already gigantic size, and blessed by the god Apollo. Thus, it was a death mission to attempt to conquer them. Thule may have not been specifically associated with giants, but both the Picts and Vikings were warriors to be feared, and the Picts were said to be larger than the average human. Beyond that, both Thule and Hyperborea were recorded as far north paradises, almost eternally lit by the sun. In fact, the sun was said to rise and set just once a year in Hyperborea. Following that idea, some did believe that Thule was the island within which the land of Hyperborea was located. Thus, for at least the past few hundred years, the two names have been mostly interchangeable. As you can see, over the past 2,000 years, Thule has been interpreted in many different lights, from history and geography to mythology and folklore. Regardless of whichever lens we view Thule, one theme does remain constant though: the island's duality. In most post-classical accounts of Thule, it's referred to as a once great, now fallen civilization. Whenever Thule is called desolate, in the next sentence it's usually called legendary. Whether or not Ultima Thule truly existed, it has inspired people for thousands of years, for better or for worse. Thus the duality of Thule lives on. The poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow perhaps encompassed this feeling better than any other, and I quote, "How far since then the ocean streams have swept us from that land of dreams, that land of fiction and of truth, the lost Atlantis of our youth. Ultima Thule, utmost isle, here in thy harbors for a while, we lower our sails, a while we rest, from the unending, endless quest." I'd like to give a massive thank you to my patrons. You all are my inspiration. In modern day, the term Ultima Thule is used to describe the greater heights we should strive for as humans, and you guys definitely represent that with your generosity. All proceeds go back into these videos, and if you want to support too, there's a link in the description. I'm Mr. Mythos. You guys are awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.